Who teaches mentors how to mentor entrepreneurs? Shouldn't we spend more time thinking about that? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Beta Kit Podcast. I am Douglas Saltis, Editor-in-Chief of Beta Kit, and my co-host, as always, is Rob Kennedy, Entrepreneur in Residence at TWG. Today we talk to Brice Scheschuk. If you're not familiar with that name, you're likely new to Canadian tech. I can't give you all of Brice's resume, but here are some of the highlights. Co-founder and CFO of Wind Mobile, managing partner of Globalive Capital, mentor at Creative Destruction Lab Toronto and Atlantic. Dude gets around. But it's his last role as mentor that is the focus of our conversation on this episode. Brice recounts a mentoring experience that had him shook, questioning everything about the systems we build to support entrepreneurs and honestly the amount of effort and thought that goes into building those systems. We also talk about MindFrame Connect, Brice's new focus, which is partially a manuscript, partially a training program, and partially a government-subsidized experiment to improve the craft of mentorship and create more resilient entrepreneurs. So sharpen your pencils and let's dig in. Brice, I want you to tell us about the last time you felt imposter syndrome.
I don't know if it's the last time, but I'll call it the most memorable in recent era time. I do a lot of mentoring in the ecosystem, as you guys know. Prior to this one day in 2018, I think all of my mentoring was done with me as the sole mentor. So I never had seen other mentors in action. And as you know, we have really no programming to teach mentors. It's all tribal. So Creative Destruction Lab Atlantic in Halifax, I show up for my first CDL mentoring day where I'm actually a mentor out in the crowd. The morning is for CDL is always small room. So you mentor with 2 or 3 other mentors and founder by founder come in 20-minute increments, speed mentoring, mentor madness. So I got my first taste of seeing other mentors in action for the first time. And then in the afternoon, CDL Atlantic, actually all CDLs bring you into what they call the big room or the large room, and all mentors come together and each company goes through a 9-minute exercise of objective setting. In that room that day, there were Sobeys, there was John Risley, there was Jim Spatz, there was George Armoyan, there was Jerry Pond, there was John Phillips, the guy who, as we know, funded Toby, first check into Shopify. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking around and I'm like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And then we go company by company and, they call on people and you can raise your hand kind of concept like in the room to speak on the topic. And I walked out of that day realizing a few things. Number one is I had been mentoring wrong, I think, on those when I was alone for my entire life. And that's like a 47-year-old business guy who co-built Wind Mobile. I thought I had decent judgment around some of the stuff we did, but the application of that judgment effectively, I had major imposter syndrome. And when you watch guys like Risley, that guy's a billionaire and he's built some serious stuff, and just his style and his competency at it, I walked out and I actually did have flat out imposter syndrome. And that is the impetus for MindFrame Connect. That started the quest.
You had obviously you'd mentioned that you're a person that has scaled and sold companies. You're not some random person off the street here. But what was it in those meetings that was reframing your perspective on how to approach this stuff? It question asks, how they're digging into things, what they're avoiding or not avoiding. As someone who's participated as a mentor myself in activities where I think the organizers were just looking for warm bodies to throw at the founders and hope for the best. What specific things were you seeing where you're like, I need to change my way? Was it something so amazing, or did they actually just even have a considered approach?
Yeah, so I think it was a mix of smart application of judgment using probably some types of structured frameworks that was really on the spot thinking. Okay, so you have to be quick, right? In a room like that, you got 9 minutes, there's pressure, it's being moderated and everyone's looking at you. So there's already a pressure syndrome created by that format. point. I mean, I look at Risley, and I'm not trying to match his experience and judgment, but he had a certain style and we call it now the competency of the craft of mentorship in terms of how he delivered the authority, the ability to take a lot of disparate points from his past and bring a very focused laser where you listen and you're like, man, that makes a whole bunch of sense. And how in the Terminator, when he has to come up with that response, which ends up being, as we know, fuck you, asshole. He has to kind of get to that through the computer. Take John Risley doing that in the brain, creating the computer for that kind of perfect articulation of how to help that entrepreneur. And I just felt like that overall, the soft side of it, the application of judgment using a certain style that gets you to the laser focus and so on. I feel like if I could remember my exact performance in there, it was more fumbly. It was less structured. I wasn't drawing upon startup vernacular the way certain others were. And I didn't get to the laser as quickly as others were doing in a smart way. The other thing that I'll say, and this was less that day on the spot, and it was a bit more after, but I realized after kind of walking the road here that there were many other things that I'd been doing wrong. To give one example, we've developed in MindFrame 15 principles of mentorship. One of those principles is listen without intent. Another one is ask questions, do not offer prescriptive advice. I was doing the opposite of both of those. They'd speak a little bit, cutting them off, chirping away, trying to give them very direct advice on the issue and so on. It was kind of the opposite of how the mentor-mentee relationship goes. And I think part of it is in the era of leadership and management that I grew up in, we were moving quickly and it was acceptable to leave bodies behind, is the term used, that type A personality that's just charging forward at a very, very aggressive clip and is in a hurry and is getting killed every day in the environments that we're operating in. That translates into a style. And I didn't move from that style effectively when I moved from, the operating CFO role to a totally different role and persona that I should have had.
No, okay, so I'm just writing some things down here. So you're saying I'm not supposed to yell at the manager. Okay. Well, no, okay, so this, again, I don't know how many employees win tatted at its apex, but this is, coming from someone, you've been a part of organizations that are quite large. This prompts you to then go conduct over 100 interviews, like 150 interviews with people. So what are you just like, I need to go learn? I got nothing else to do. I've got a couple free days in my calendar. I'm going to go interview. How does this moment of self-realization turn into like a program, as process of capturing all this information?
So first thing I did is I wanted to self-learn, and I had this notion of the project. But what I did is I went out and I did research. Typical, right? Let's figure out what to do right. And I did it all online. And the first thing you find out is there are very little resources on this that are useful to our ecosystem. And what's fascinating to me is that the accelerator programs, studios, labs, incubators, accelerators, generally are mentor-mentee centered programs. You bring in a bunch of skilled business builders, and they are asked to mentor the next gen or the founders or whatever. So they actually promote their mentors. I had never had 1 minute of programming that is like elevating the craft of mentorship, as we call it. And when I went out, what I basically found, if I could summarize, a few books that were generic, not specific to our ecosystem, and the Techstars Mentor Manifesto, which is 17 principles. And there's a blog post that describes each one in a little bit more detail. That was it. So I worked to get better at it just from what I could find. I worked to get more into CDL and get better in group mentor sessions. And I just started mentoring more. So like Founder Institute, Sunil sets up something where each week there is 3 or 4 of us. It's a different style of mentorship. It's more pitch mentorship and a presentation. I have done the equity and fundraising one, I think 15 times now. And it puts you on the spot to judge ventures, and you do have peers there that you can watch as well. So I tried to set all of that up in the best way possible. And what's interesting is that Techstars, they're massive, right? Globally, they have probably thousands of mentors. They created a program called the Global All-Star Mentor Pool, and Sunil gave me a nomination there. And so I found myself in a spot where I was on calls at Techstars where this was pandemic. So we were into video, big global video. There'd be 200 people, 100, 200 people on the call, facilitated by a mentor, a Techstars mentor person, community person. And the mentors on that call globally were asking for this. So it became like, you want to talk about customer discovery as a construct within startup. This was our customer discovery. When the pandemic hit, I've kind of got this on the side. I've got the idea of it. I want to write something about this. I know I want to do it, but I can never find the time. Pandemic hits, and what happens? So Alex Norman runs the Tech TO, the big virtual town hall that we all remember. He asked me to speak at that, and I did. And then I did a whole bunch of mentoring at the start of the pandemic around, decision making under uncertainty, how to simplify and prioritize all the things that we did in the pandemic. And I started to really see some value and learning that I was doing there. And I said, I got to do this summer. Everyone's on video. I believe that I can interview people much more broadly than I normally would have. We launched the project. We did 150 interviews. You would know 90% of the people, Ruffalo, Romano, Alex Norman, five universities.
John Ruffalo, formerly of Omers, now for Mavericks Private Equity. Michelle Romanov of Clearco. Yeah. Alex Norman, TechTO. You had mentioned Asinal Sharma, who's running Founder Institute and Techstars. Just for our listeners who probably are familiar with these orgs but aren't.
Amit Shah at Golden
Bench.
Kelly Breslin Wright, who I got introduced to, who was the founding sales and marketing person at Tableau, had 1,500 sales and marketing people underneath her. She was awesome. When we started the project, we were like, let's do 100 people and let's kind of figure out some investor, some university, some mentor, some mentee, some founder. We kind of had this idea. And we said to ourselves, we want to be good soldiers. We want to do 50 men, 50 women. Let's get proper gender diversity here. First interview we do, we have some inkling of going beyond just female, and we want to talk about EDI more smartly. First person we get introduced and networked to is a woman named Dr. Linda Maxwell, who runs the Ryerson Biomedical Zone. The point of that interview was to ask her about EDI as it relates to being a mentor and a mentee. That interview blew us out of the water. We should not have done it first because it was a pretty complicated topic to discuss, but we did. And she was awesome. She was very clear with us in a fair way what we were getting into and how we should be thinking about these issues. And so that actually changed the project, where we recalibrated to 150 and we added community representation: Black, Indigenous, immigrant, refugee, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, women. And it became something so much more profound than what I was expecting when we started. Because I'll give you a couple of examples. We interviewed an Indigenous woman by the name of Jennifer Harper. She is a founder of a company called Cheekbone Beauty, which is makeup for certain skin. You guys have probably heard of her. It would be the most profound interview of the project. She, within a very short period of time, gave us a bit of a history of her life and her family and the trauma and the multi-generational trauma and suicide and various other things that talked through her story of getting through addiction and other challenges, and then founding a company and with a family kind of legacy concept and building a business and becoming a role model. And we actually had to pause the interview once because everyone was so emotional. It made me realize things on a couple of different layers. Layer one is, we should do better as an ecosystem at the craft of mentoring and menteeing. And I could talk to you about principles. And if you talk about mentees, no one tells them how to do better, yet the relationship is supposed to center on them. What ends up happening is a bunch of big ego mentors come in the room with the 10 commandments, and Moses comes down from Sinai and gives that as prescriptive advice. It's the absolute wrong way to mentor. So there was that dimension. But then the other dimension is, I thought, 50-year-old white guy, I had worked with all colors, ethnicities, genders, and I thought I was a good soldier trying to advance the cause. I realized after Dr. Linda Maxwell and Jen Harper, I was nowhere on these issues. And after doing 50, 60 discussions on this, it made me realize that so what we ended up doing, if I could summarize, is we wrote a 100,000 word manuscript, 15 principles of mentorship, 25 principles of menteeship, 19 EDI principles. And we've turned those now into synchronous workshops where each of those has been built out into a slide set that I can do in an hour. And in the case of EDI, it will be done alongside others that represent the communities. And we will create an ambassador concept where others can start to do it. We've done a bunch of them now, and it's really starting to hit stride. That's a very long discussion of kind of the origin story. The summer of 2020, I had a research assistant co-write it with me, and now turning it into something bigger with the Future Skills Grant and so on.
That's awesome. And I think just for our listeners there who, in Brice speaking of Jen Harper and Cheap One Beauty, if that story sounds slightly familiar, I strongly recommend they check out our podcast episode with Paula Sert from Raven Indigenous Capital Partners and check out that episode. But, Brice, I think to all of the white guys on this podcast, none of what you're saying is unfamiliar, because I think we have all participated in some sort of pizza and beer meetup, founder support situation where it was incumbent upon whoever had raised capital, exited, or had capital to invest to get up and just publicly shit on someone's pitch towards their benefit. And usually it was welcomed as a rite of passage. And someone who's participated in like local accelerators, it turned into a less entertaining gongless version of the Gong Show. But everyone there was like, this is the work that we need to do. But it was not good work. I want to just, even before we get to what the journey you've been on has turned into, stop and for a second and just ask the question of, what are the conditions that led to such a dearth of mentorship training, lack of understanding of how mentees should engage with mentors or receive the feedback? Why is it that people like me can give advice to founders where at that point I had been maybe an entrepreneur myself for like 6 minutes? What is the circumstance? Was it specific to the Canadian tech ecosystem? Is this something that you're seeing across North America or worldwide? Why has there been so little time and attention put towards the process of teaching entrepreneurs how to scale businesses?
From what I could tell in trying to figure out some of the origins, so prior to the mid-2000s, mentorship was kind of this thing that happened in corporations where, you've got a VP that mentors someone. It's a matching program, and it's done for almost like corporate advocacy purposes. Then in the Valley, it started, again, always led by the Valley. They were better at this. Like, to give you an example, Kelly Breslin-Wright at Tableau said when she took the chair of sales and marketing, she didn't know what she was doing. Very candid. And she's like, I just started calling peers at other enterprise software companies and kind of just forced my way into getting them to mentor me and tell me about their experiences. So the Valley started very tribal and unstructured. And then we have the seminal foundings of YC and Techstars in the mid-2000s that are mentor-centric programs. Now, I have never been able to find out exactly why they didn't focus on the elevation of mentors themselves from a craft standpoint. The Mentor Manifesto came out, which was a bit of a small attempt to do that. You guys have seen the 17 principles and probably the blog post. That's pretty basic. I think what ends up happening is people don't want to bruise mentor egos. And it's like, these guys built businesses. They're just great at what they do. To have done that, the results speak for themselves. Let's let them loose. And you know what? If there's a real problem, okay, if we get some feedback from mentees that says this person is creeping out, part of the mentee base or whatever the issue is, they're yelling and screaming and blah, blah, blah. They quietly get edged out. Hey, maybe this isn't for you. Maybe you don't want to come back. But there is very little to no formal feedback loops to go and ask. Another example of an interview. One of the principles, mentors always ask for feedback at the end of a meeting. So Craig Elias, excellent guy out in Alberta, said to me at the end of every meeting, I ask my mentees on a scale of 1 to 10, how do I do? And how do I make it a 10? Why does he do that? Because no one provides him feedback. I was on a call today with Techstars Global, the current heads of the mentor groups, and they are working on these issues that we're talking about. Okay, it is 2021. It started in '06. I don't want to talk negatively about Techstars. Love the program. Been mentoring there globally for a long time. They are getting the fact that we need to up that game. And so I can speculate on not wanting to bruise ego, wanting to have the name brand business people in your program to attract founders, but even though they may not be the best at mentoring, and the list would go on. And you know what? A lot of these are run their businesses, right? Techstars is a business. It gets equity when it brings companies in and so on. And they will pick where they prioritize, how they manage burn rate, and where they want to. And maybe this just hasn't been an area where all of the accelerators have had to focus. And look, I'm in CDL, guys, and I'm active in CDL. Same issue. I did CDL Atlantic mentor presentation, was my first presentation. Funnily, I went full circle back to Atlantic to do the presentation that I wish I would have gotten. And the mentors gave us amazing feedback. They're like, this is outstanding. This is making us the other interesting thing, by the way, we say in our mentor pillars of mentorship slide, this will make you a better human and leader. And we had one mentor say, this will make me a better dad. Like, these are the skills that humans do for proper interaction that is respectful, not an interaction that is like fluffy and not giving good, solid, constructive, radical feedback, but it's done in a way that is sensible and gives the best experience to propel that mentee on their journey. So we did that. We did the mentee presentation to Sunil's latest cohort at Techstars Toronto. And I think Sunil said right at the end of it, he said, like, wow, where has this been? And so it is a thing. It is missing. And we are going to solve that gap. We are going to take it global. I believe it's not at all specific to Canada. It's a global issue. So we do not lag our peers or something in any way. And this is going, you know what, we can take this out to the world in a way like CDL has kind of gone out to the world and so on. And I think we can have positive impact here.
Hey, do you want to work where your imagination makes an impact? Join Tech at RBC, a fast-paced team of innovators working to create positive change for their clients and communities. At RBC, you'll build a meaningful career while working on high-impact projects with some of the top tech and business experts in the country. RBC is hiring for a range of tech positions, from developers to data scientists to cybersecurity professionals and more. So check out the latest roles at jobs.rbc.com/tech.
I think you hit the mark when you talked about the accelerators and their value props. I mean, like, especially in the 2010s when everyone had an accelerator, what's the difference? The difference is, can you attract fancy business people, get them to pay attention? So it's like the headlines of who you got to talk. And quite frankly, that led to like that successful business person potentially putting money where their mouth was, right? That's what success looked like to them. Wasn't well-rounded humans. It was funded companies to show that they could actually, mentorship was a byproduct. If they happened to get some good shit, that's great. So I think that the motivation was kind of different. I don't think it was like maliciously not about mentorship, but I just think it was not the first or second or third thing on the list. The way you've described it, it's so expansive. Mentorship about parenting, mentorship. Is there something startup-y about it? Because irrespective of how you measure it, I've seen, very successful business people who have not started companies, and they're not the ones who should be necessarily advising early stage entrepreneurs, because they don't actually know, because they're, they've got their MBA, they've run, Bell or TELUS or Goldman. That doesn't mean they can do the 0 to 1. They can do the 2 to 3. They can do the IPO. So I understand that the fundamentals of mentorship about listening and all those other things are deep, important human characteristics. Is there something that you found startup-y or entrepreneurial that you've imbued into this? Or is there really, it's not as specific to the ecosystem or any stage of company?
So mentorship can be provided by non-founders, but it should also be provided by founders. Okay, so let's start there. Amit Shah gets the lead quote in the chapter called Mentoring Founders. And he says something, I can't remember it exactly, but he says something at Golden Ventures. Founder comes into our fund they immediately get mentored by the founder that came in just before them. They age, the next founder comes in, they start mentoring. So there's a founder to founder cycle there that helps them walk that painful journey that they're all on. And the act of being mentored is helpful to you, obviously, as a mentee. The act of mentoring down is helpful to you as a human and a leader. So it is super important that founders are involved in the mentoring process. And I would say every slide deck I've put out in the last 5 years on any topic has a slide saying it is our responsibility as business entrepreneurs to mentor the next generation. So that's flat out. Now, the other side of mentorship is that you do have domain expertise, law, IP. There are people that I see at CDL that are absolute experts in IP and how to think about IP strategy and IP legal and so on. And you want that deep domain as well. And that you don't have to have been necessarily a founder to, you need a portfolio that maybe you've seen it a little bit or you're a lawyer. So it can go in a few different directions. And but where I would also go is that you do find the non-zero to ones, or maybe people that founded companies in different eras, like Risley, let's take an example, and maybe they invest a lot and they see the signals of that. Maybe I'm like that, right? Wind is not a technology startup in the classic sense. So the entrepreneurial pillars for us span 4 topics: resiliency in the mental game, having mentors and coaches, understanding frameworks, and your own life competencies. Are you a good storyteller? Are you good at product iteration? Are you a person of character, integrity?
Socialized human being.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever those competencies are. Frameworks is where I'm going up with the answer to your question, Rob. What we say to mentors is if you're going to come into the startup ecosystem 0 to 1, you need to have an understanding of the vernacular, the categories, the popular frameworks. You have your judgment, and you need to have the frameworks to help you have systems to logically apply your judgment in a current context. So a category would be business building, lean startup, disciplined entrepreneurship. The list would go on and on and on. And we have in the manuscript, chapter 6, which is mentoring founders, is basically a lengthy articulation of frameworks. Now, to go a little further, remember, this isn't only startup, right? You cross the chasm and you're now in scale up. Well, what do you do there? Well, that's a whole other animal of peers that are at the same stage as you. I interviewed Dennis Kavelman, John Ruffalo, and Bruce Croxon about scaling. Okay. And look, Dennis, as we know, took BlackBerry from almost 0 to almost, towards the end. And so that guy has more scale up experience than most people in the country. But Kavelman gave me a great articulation about how to think about business changing from startup to scale up. You need the Kavelmans, like Innovia's growth fund with Pichette and Kavelman brings the skill set, right? And then you layer on the craft to it and you just have this absolute power.
So the reason why there's over 150 interviews is that you needed to capture the variety of perspectives, experience, and stages so that the kind of format you were putting people through made sure that they always had the kind of right kind of advice. Because I wouldn't ask Amit any sort of advice about, wardrobe, sports choices, things like that. Yeah, but there are specific
Katie, cut that.
Fields where Katie, keep that in.
Big stupid.
Because Amit listens to this podcast. He's been on the podcast before.
Yes.
And I've also, brought him into a whiteboarding session, seen him just chew the marker in half, basically burning through the board with ideas. So I think that's well taken. I'm wondering now, like Jose, you've been talking about this book, turning this manuscript. You're gonna, I think, in a very flawed way, look to publish this on your own site instead of publishing it on BetaKit. But that isn't the current output of this. So like, I think maybe now this is where we talk about like how this journey has led to what exactly like MindFrame Connect is and what you're trying to do. I think we got to talk about how you're being funded, who you're being funded by, partnering with, and how this gets disseminated, because we're also currently in an environment, I think we're referencing a lot of scenarios where, at least right now at the moment, there are not a lot of pizza and beer meetups for founders. Now, there are a lot of Zoom calls like the one we happen to be on. How does that change the dynamic? Is it helping? Is it hurting? Are you providing greater access across Canada? Let's start digging into now the program behind the information that you've captured and how you put it out into the world.
Do you guys know Jeff Larson at Dalhousie? He runs CL Atlantic and Entrepreneurship and Innovation out there.
I think he's sitting beside Rob right now. We'd like to welcome, no.
That's a picture.
We have a special surprise guest for you today named Jeffrey Larson. Jeff Larson's become a friend. He was at that CDL Atlantic session in 2018. I interviewed 5 universities. He was one on these same topics. And he called me in February of this year. And he said, we should do something bigger with what you're thinking about, because a static book is not the only way to deliver. Great comment. Jeff happens to have a particular skill in the grant and not-for-profit world. So we put a grant application together to Future Skills. In case people don't know, that's a bucket of funding that is focused on upskilling the Canadian economy. And they basically get applications and they look at the relevance of that application to their mission and they approve some. And so the people I worked with knew the application process, and we believe that it was compelling. And I will slip in a little added thing here. We knew it was about elevating the craft of mentorship, but we also had another issue that was bugging us in the ecosystem, and that was around the skills needed to develop entrepreneurial resilience. And this is the mental game of entrepreneurship. And I can tell you categorically, the accelerators that I interacted with, the founders that I interacted with, it was always customer development discovery, minimum viable product, business model mapping, total addressable market, go, hustle. No one was talking about the dark days of entrepreneurship and how you manage it. And after the pandemic, and after how we reacted at the start of the pandemic, it struck me that this was a pillar that we needed to work on. So we slipped in. We didn't know much about the actual way we would work that when we put the application, but we said it also needs to have this. And actually it ties back to mentorship, because mentors being aware of the topic. I will tell you guys that as I've gone on in mentoring, most of my mentoring is around resiliency in the mental game of entrepreneurship, and more the human, the team, the culture, the mission, the value side, as opposed to call 50 customers in a structured way and ask them what their problems are. So they accepted it. We got a very nice sized grant, and we are on a blitz now to develop the content and programming in digestible ways in the new world of learning, anchored with a manuscript and a 1-hour synchronous workshop cut 4 or 5 ways. And then in behind that is going to be a whole bunch of stuff. So I'll give you one example. Tony Lacavera, my business partner, and Michael Bancroft, as you know, they do Beyond Innovation for Bloomberg. They're going to do a professional quality shoot with a sequence of people that either appeared in the book or are relevant to the discussion around mentorship. I think we will likely do a separate professional shoot on the topic of skills to build resiliency. That would be one type of content. We're going to do a lot of 3-minuters asynchronous that allows you to go deeper on each principle. What we're basically trying to do is find ways that anyone in the way content is consumed in this limited attention span world we live in can find a way. Our on-ramps, let me spend a minute on that. We do not want to do one-on-one presentations about this. It's inefficient and unscalable. So the first thing that we did is we went out to all the usual cast of characters: CDL, Communitech, Mars, Next, Techstars, Founder Institute, you name it. And they generally have all signed up in some way, shape, or form to run a workshop. So we've run 6 now, I think. Mentor, mentee, resilience. We haven't done EDI yet. We're getting ready on that. And that's a 1 hour, and it's either Zoom with me presenting it so far, or I've done 2 in person. I did Entrepreneur First in Mars building, 60 people. That was awesome. And I just did Koru, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan new startup platform in a CEO offsite. So it's happening. And we want to do that globally with Techstars on Zoom. I'd love to do that to 200-300 people. We're going to start doing, so Techstars Toronto, we did the mentees. We would like to do other Techstars cohorts in other places and start measuring effectiveness against cohorts that haven't done it. Ask the mentees, okay, you got this at the start. Did this work for your overall journey through the mentor madness process at Techstars? And eventually we want to get a flywheel going. We want to really probably reduce the cost ultimately over time as content is produced and it becomes more incremental. And we're going to figure out a sustaining model over time. Look, you think about, everyone wants to reach entrepreneurs, startups, founders, and business people. This will be a way to do that. We feel pretty good about that.
Maybe if we could just pause on that, because I think that is sort of the critical piece to it, and something that's kind of different, but I'd like to unpack it further. Sort of the feedback loop when I've done mentorship or I've been mentored, unless the person is just absolutely shitty, you'll probably get a nugget of something. And I've done mentorship where I've actually asked for NPS at the end of it,
Nice.
as invalid or valid as that might be, just
That's
to get
best
like
practice, by the way.
you're going to get, yeah, he's a good guy. I'd have a beer with him. But what I'm struggling with is, how do you actually know that they're effective mentors in the longitudinal sense, such that they're actually moving the needle on the business? Mental resiliency is important because if the founder's head's in the game, they can continue to, they can turn off when they need to turn off and turn on when they need to turn on, and they're making the right calls. I just worry about how do you know? Because I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, the ultimate outcome is to have a sort of, as you said at the end, a self-perpetuating cycle where good mentors give good mentorship to entrepreneurs. That continues in a virtuous way. And then those entrepreneurs also start to become mentors, and that sort of flywheel continues in that manner. So again, how do you know that other than, he's a good guy, 9 out of 10, you're actually improving the craft of mentorship, and then I guess improving the ecosystem within which we all live?
What I would say to you is, so we are going to try to do within a soft skills area some measurement of effectiveness through the structured programs. Look, I think one of the core aspects of this is educating mentees on what to expect from the experience. It's like if a guy comes in with a baseball bat and starts swinging it at your head about your business idea.
Thank you, sir. Can I have another?
Yeah. Hit
I'm
me
a founder.
again, please.
Yeah.
The knights who say knee, that's but a flesh wound. And so we want mentees to understand that it's a respectful, the power dynamic, blah, blah, blah. But core principle, you need multiple mentors. You go with one guy like me, you get my biases, my insights, and so on. You go with 5 guys that look like me, you've gone one better, but not great. You get 5 people that look different, sound different, have different experiences, different ages, and so on. Diversity of thought. We know that term. Personal board of directors. Okay. So we're trying to get the mentee set up to understand, okay, so if I've got 5 mentors, they're not all going to be probably perfect in the start of the relationship. And maybe I have to rotate, and there's a discussion about how to do that respectfully and so on. And so the goal is to create the conditions where a mentee is empowered to be successful by having diversity of thought and being able to build their own judgment, particularly if there's conflicting guidance. We can't, Leibowitz said it well from Plaza. We were talking about you, as a mentee, you ultimately have to own your decision, and you can never blame a mentor, right? And he said something to the effect of, we can give you our best, but we can't fight the fight for you. So what I'm trying to do is create the conditions for ultimate success, create the conditions for a mentee to understand diversity of thought, and then ultimately they have to take ownership. And I can't force that.
Is this almost a philosophical question? Is this a knowable thing, or is this the entrepreneur in some qualitative way that is turned quantitative, say, yes, there was an impact on my business. I can't tell you it's 0.37% on revenue or cost optimization. I can tell you I received value because I didn't murder anybody. And you're like, great. Is that basically where we're at? I know you don't know yet.
I don't know yet. CDL is very economically measurable driven. So they've tried to look at the objective setting process, how it changed at the start of the day to the end of the day. Where did it move? Typically, if I could give you a quick data point on CDL, typically what happens is the objectives set by the companies are very product focused and inward focused, and the mentors move them to the customer and to kind of looking out into the world. And so CDL tries to measure changes in objective setting, and how does that help for effectiveness? And can we start building a playbook almost that reduces the need to have to reset all the time on those things? We have talked to them about getting very kind of economic on our measurements of this. I think it's not totally dissimilar to a startup. Okay. So remember that product market fit issue. What is product market fit? Ultimately, it's that your customers don't churn, if you want to get right to the base definition, but you can't wait and wait for churn to be your measure, right? So what do? You look at net promoter score. You look at customers that can't live without you. You use the Roberge framework to find the leading indicator that tells you that your customers love you.
Churn is lagging.
Okay. Slack, the thing about once a person has sent X messages through Slack, they're hooked. And there's like a 99% likelihood they won't churn. And you know that within the first 30 days.
Yeah. And then they start paying because they're like, oh my God, all my messages are stuck in Slack. We have literally we pay for very few types of software at BetaKit, and Slack was one of them.
Slack is one. You
well
can't
played.
avoid
Slow
it.
golf clap.
Yeah, so Stuart gets the win on that. But the point is that will we get to that level of measurement? Honestly, guys, I don't know. We're talking a bit of a human condition. How well do you measure leadership outcomes and things like that? But I am wide open on trying to figure this out. And even, I would look to anyone to tell me how to measure stuff better in these softer areas.
Is some of the emphasis on resilience with this a little bit of hedge against maybe the achievability of quantitative measurement? Because if you can socialize leaders to a certain extent, even if that educational process was a little icky, you're at least giving people the capacity to either make their own decisions and own those decisions. Or is that just a secondary benefit? Is that when you're coming to resilience, is that ultimately the benefit? And that if you can train mentors that can help train resilience, then all those other lagging indicators that can only be tracked at a 90-degree angle will just be trailing indicators of the program's success?
We have taken resiliency as almost its own separate animal. We have told mentors that it exists and that they can join and be interested and grab onto it if they want. We don't know yet how that's going to go. So I believe actually fundamentally that let's say there was no resiliency stream. I do believe that we are making better humans in this area that will benefit the ecosystem. We will try to measure it. Resiliency to me fits in because mentors very quickly will realize look, when I get the mentor call from the founder that said the sixth wave of competition from well-funded Silicon Valley is coming, I can't get up in the morning and do this again. I can't fight the next one. It's killing me. Or we had a portfolio company that lost 95% of its revenue in the pandemic. Those are tough phone calls. That's where you, as a mentor, you realize that your training on resiliency is probably getting your ass kicked in your own business and not really having a framework for it. And so hopefully that does come into the process and that they learn and so on. It's very early in the mentoring founders chapter because it's so bloody important. So I would call it less of a hedge, Doug, than a separate white space that can be tied into it if people want to learn on it. We have to own this space of mentorship somehow, and we have to figure out outcomes that are beneficial.
So tying this back, how will you evaluate this program's success? We talked a little bit about the ultimate goal, and what does that look like? When do you know you've got a program that is functional? When do you know that, hey, the funding you got was worth it? Or when do you say, hey, from my own perspective, we've all the people that we talk to, this isn't working, we need to shut it down or pivot or do all the things that you'd be advising founders to do with their own businesses? What are you looking to do there, and when do you make the call?
So look, I think we start with the easy feedback, the basics. Send surveys after, listen, see how people come back to us, and so on. Let's call that customers who can't live without you, or kind of net promotery score-ish.
Your net mentor score.
Yeah, net mentor score, something like that. Okay.
M&Ms.
Then we try to do a bit of longitudinal. I'm a mentee at Techstars. I get this thing before Mentor Madness. And then at the end of Mentor Madness, I now have a context. Okay. Let's talk through that feedback. Where did we miss and not? So, but still, let's call it survey-ish. Okay. And then I think a lot of what we had already talked about is there repeated demand from accelerators for each cohort to go through this again and again? Are we able to survey mentors longitudinally to see both how they up their game? Could we ask them for success stories? Can we start getting into case studies and so on? I think it's hard to measure ROI perfectly here because it is the nature of this beast that we're trying to do. So those would be some immediate thoughts. And look, what our goal is definitely to get sustained. And the way you get sustained is by having others see long-term benefit to their businesses by supporting you. And that is, I think, going to be the ultimate indicator.
Okay, I guess maybe final question to wrap this up, and I think possibly the most important one that we have. Is it still okay to throw things at the startups? No.
The days of the crazy CEO throwing things around a room, I think, are not really as cool anymore.
All right, well, duly noted.
One thing we didn't do, and I know we're out of time, is we didn't really dive into resiliency. But I noticed that you did a podcast, I think, with Dr. Michael Freeman.
Yes.
So I talked to him on Friday. He's kind of one of the worldwide experts on entrepreneurial resiliency.
It was incredible.
He was great. Yeah.
So we had this exceptional discussion with him around, you guys could pin me against a wall on how do you make this, how do you make developing the skills of entrepreneurial resiliency practical.
We promised to have him back, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Remember, Douglas? Yeah. We're like, let's have you back, because we talked to him right in the pit of COVID,
Oh, yeah.
A follow-up conversation with him and you on resilience, I think, would be amazing, because there were a lot of founders, even earlier before that, we were having Michael Hyatt on the podcast talking about everyone is now a wartime CEO. And there was such an energy just towards kind of just saddling up to survive in whatever way to get through. And I think there are a lot of founders that are now who have made it through, because if they haven't made it through by now, like, they're just not around anymore. And they're probably looking around and saying, what next? Oh yeah, by the way, our business has either gone sideways or it's exploded. None of my employees want to work in an office anymore. And 5 other things are happening. That phone call of like, this is the 5th one in a row. I can't handle it. I think
I started a podcast just to figure out whether I could do another startup. That was the first startup podcast I did, was just be like, can I do this again? Will it hurt? Right. And I think the other thing, Douglas, like, we mentioned this on Michael's episode, and I think what would be a really interesting conversation would be, when is it psychiatric and when is it business? And that is a blurry line. The mentor going into the psychiatric, it's easy to do and it's dangerous. And my psychiatrist giving me business advice, not the most useful use of his time. And that's a very interesting area, because depression is, people who are in this crazy little field of ours tend to have comorbidities, if you want to put it mildly.
Well, I'm super appreciative that you guys grounded this in a very important and topical space after I made a joke about throwing things at people. Brice, thank you so much for this. And we look forward to having you on again.
Awesome, guys. Really appreciate it. Everything you do for the ecosystem. Keep up the good work.
The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit with support from TWG. Our producer is Katie Lohr, and our hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.